Welcome to Just Theory. Our guest in this episode is Sarah Lawsky, Professor of Law and Vice Dean at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, where she researches tax law and the application of formal logic and artificial intelligence to the law. In this episode, we are discussing Professor Lawsky's forthcoming paper, Coding the Code, Catalan and Computationally Accessible Tax Law. We discuss algorithms, logic, and how tech solutions to simple legal problems can be an easy win for all. So, without further ado, I present to you Episode 4, on the power of logic. It's always the first 30 seconds that's really awkward after you press this button, because we've had this conversation, we've been having this conversation offline, and then all of a sudden everything is recorded and the dynamic changes.
Yes.
But we would like to welcome Professor Sarah Lawsky today. We will be discussing her inspiration for her career, as usual we do in this podcast, but also her current project, the title of which is Coding the Code, Catalan and Computationally Accessible Tax Law. And you very kindly shared this draft with us, so thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
And if we start just with a question of your career in academia, what brought you here and what made you stay, more importantly?
My path was perhaps a little bit different. So I have a very long-standing interest in logic, back to when I was actually a kid. And that, was when I was in 6th grade, I had if you guys remember, they used to have all of the modus ponens and modus tollens, but there were 30 of them. They were all the different. So I had signs on my wall that I had made that was all the different, the different logic rules. And I studied in college logic, and actually had the opportunity to start studying non-standard logics as well. And that was through working with David Malamud, who was at the University of Chicago at the time and was a wonderful mentor and support for me. And then after college, after I worked for a little while, I actually went to law school finished law school, became a lawyer, was a lawyer for quite a while, and then decided to go into legal academia. So then I was a legal academic. And then after I got tenure as a legal academic, I said, now I can go back and finally study this stuff again that I've been waiting to study. So it's a little bit of a different path, where I actually went back to philosophy actually after I was already a tenured academic. So it's a little different.
It's absolutely fascinating. Our other guests also had the kind of mixed path before they arrived at where they are in their research.
So we like difference. It makes it more interesting.
So
that's actually an interesting question, is whether, and I don't know, and you all might be in a better position to answer this after you do a bunch of these interviews, but I wonder if having a longer path or a less direct path where we did other things before leads to maybe a more solid base that lets someone enjoy the job a little bit more, as opposed to a more direct. It might not just be kind of random. A more direct path actually may make it much more difficult, maybe just internally, to have a rewarding career.
Emilia, I know who you're thinking about, and Mary Midgley, the person we launched with. And yeah, you should probably bring it up now.
I wasn't thinking about Mary Midgley on this occasion, whose approach obviously was this eclectic approach to doing academic research. So not analyzing phenomena in isolation, but against wider background, gaining greater understanding of where we stand as human beings against very many different backgrounds. What I was thinking of was actually artificial intelligence, not Mary Midgley, because that made me think having that more robust background means that we gain greater understanding of the field. But is that true of some artificial intelligence systems, that the greater amount of data they have, the more likely it is that they will become more intelligent if we can ever have intelligent machines? Do they have?
I don't think so. Not with the current approach. I mean, this is a little bit outside my area of expertise, a lot outside my area of expertise, actually. I don't take the big data approaches. I'm not particularly, focused on anything like machine learning, but I don't think we have any reason to believe that under the current model of machine learning that we're going to reach a tipping point with amount of data that will allow these larger connections to be made. I've seen no evidence of that. I think that an indirect path can be helpful in a number of ways. One is I think people are more grounded, but also something that I think a machine really couldn't do, which is to actually have different intellectual approaches and letting those different intellectual approaches reinforce each other. So not just a different set of knowledge, but a different, really a different methodological approach, and letting those two methodologies interact, I think can also be really professionally rewarding and interesting.
So the machines can never really be, at least as the situation stands, be truly intelligent. The semantic leap.
I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical. I mean, there's others who are way more expert in this particular area, but based on the reading I've done, I'm pretty skeptical that with what we've got, this is really outside my area, so I'm really talking out of school, as it were. But my sense at this point is that there's going to have to be some kind of adjustment of the underlying models before really significant that kind of leap can happen. I mean, I don't think there's any sense we could actually be talking about that we're really talking about learning or any kind of comprehension right now.
I mean, academically, I always think that we should sort out our approach to empirical studies and empirical analysis and all the gaps that are occurring there and people misinterpreting the statistics all the time before we even say that, actually, the more data we have, the better. Well, the more data we have, the better we're going to get at some kind of pattern recognition.
Yes, I agree completely.
What this pattern recognition is.
Yes, I totally agree with that.
But that kind of brings us to the heart of our discussion today. What made you pursue this project? What inspired you to pursue this project?
So I was not a big fan of law school at all. I did not find it, I didn't like the way that texts were approached in law school. It didn't fit well with the way that I sort of think about things or approach things. And I actually didn't come to tax law until after I was in law school. And though that was the area I practiced in, and then studied further in that area. So after my JD program is when I turned to tax law. And tax is very different than other areas of law. It is highly rule-based in the United States and in other countries as well. Lawyers are paid to tell people what the law is, which is not that common in law. Usually you're not paid to tell someone what the law is. You're paid to argue about a case or to, but tax law is so complicated that actually a good amount of what tax lawyers do is figure out what the law says and then work with their clients on that. And I love that kind of complexity of rules. Now, separately from that, I had this ongoing interest, but it's not surprising that since I'm only one person, my two interests were the same interest. So when I went to graduate school, I worked with Sean Walsh there, was one of my advisors there. And Sean, so I went knowing that I wanted to study logic. And Sean was the person who pointed me in the direction of the work of Jeff Horty about default logic as a way of modeling actually in Horty's work and some of his work after his really core book, but then he has some later work about using default logic to model common law reasoning. But seeing the connection there, that was really the connection that Horty made initially. It was really like, I mean, the sort of the moment of understanding what was going on with this non-monotonic logic and seeing it connecting to tax was really exciting for me, because I've been thinking about this statute for a long time at that point. And it was as if I could see the bones underlying the statute. And so I didn't necessarily come in knowing exactly how I wanted the logic stuff to apply to the law part. But I did come in with interests that were consistent with my being only a single person. And so, was able to bring those two together into this project.
You did mention some terms of art here. So I was wondering if we could explain to our listeners what default logic is as opposed to standard or formal logic.
Yeah. Sure.
And what's the distinction between monotonic and non-monotonic processing in
Sure.
default logic?
So let me start with monotonic versus non-monotonic reasoning. Monotonic reasoning is monotonic logics, or is the kind of logic that standard logic is. So if somebody tells you if A, then B, and then they tell you A, at that point you conclude B, and you add B to your set of things that you believe, and it never comes out. There's no mechanism in standard logic by which B would ever come out of the set of things you believe. And so in that sense, it's monotonic because it moves only in one direction, as things that you believe accumulate. Non-monotonic logic is different. Non-monotonic logic lets you hold beliefs and then give up the beliefs later if you learn something that's inconsistent with the beliefs. So it's non-monotonic because it doesn't move only in one direction. You might add some things and then learn something else and then take those out of the set of things you believe and then add some more things. So the really standard example is Tweety is a bird. And at that point, if you had to conclude something, you would say Tweety can fly. So you've added the belief Tweety can fly. Then someone gives you additional information. Tweety is a penguin. Now you remove the belief that Tweety can fly because you have additional information. And this is in fact how we reason in our lives. We don't add things to our belief set and then just things about, every day, and then refuse to retract them when we get it. And we also don't wait until we have full information because we also couldn't function that way. So this is sometimes, this kind of reasoning is sometimes called the logic of everyday reasoning, because this is actually how we reason in the real world.
What I found really interesting in your paper, you did associate this logic with the logic of rules and exceptions.
That's another, right, exactly. So this is another way that is sometimes characterized, and this is the bridge to the statute. So it's the logic of rules and exceptions because we can say, as a rule, birds fly. But there are exceptions to that. Penguins don't fly. I don't know if emus fly, but there might be a few birds that don't fly. And so there's a general rule, and then there are exceptions to that rule. And as it happens, just as a matter of fact, or descriptively, it's the case that this is how statutes are drafted in the United States. And actually, it turns out in France as well. Statutes are drafted as general rules followed by exceptions. And every lawyer knows it would be strange to have to say it. And when you have a general rule and then you have an exception, the specific controls the general. And this is so much the case that if you look at a statute, it doesn't say in the statute, oh, this is an exception. It doesn't. Everybody knows that this is how you read a statute. So because the statute is drafted this way, it would be more convenient to have a logic that lets you write down general rules followed by exceptions and say, hey, this is an exception and it beats this general rule. And this is an exception to the exception, so it beats this exception. And it just makes it easier to write it down. And so that, and now how do you write down? There's a lot of different ways, a lot of different non-monotonic logics. The one that I focus on is default logic. And that's largely, I would say, largely entirely because that's what Horty focuses on. And that book was Reasons as Default. So it was tremendously influential, in the work that I'm doing. And so that's the non-monotonic logic that I work with.
Well, at this stage, I must come back to our initial conversation about artificial intelligence, even though it's not, you made it clear that this is not your field. But there seems to be, in your work, there is an assumption that default logic is superior to standard logic for analyzing law, precisely because it allows to make that distinction between the rule and exception. And it can, the exception can, in some circumstances, overrule the principle. This made me think that actually default logic contains an element of choice. as opposed to standard logic, which does not allow for the choice of when to make when exception overrules the rule or the principle. So my question is, do you think there are some maybe seeds of intelligence in default logic, in a sense that it incorporates an element of choice?
I'm not sure it does incorporate an element of choice, at least not default logic as I'm familiar with it, because the rules have, I work with prioritized default logic. Rules have priorities. You don't get to pick, I mean, you get to pick what the priorities are, but you get to pick all kinds of things when you write down things in logical form. So it does crank out an answer. I mean, if it didn't, if there were sort of forks where somebody had to choose in something other than how they wrote things down, that'd be a little bit of a problem for the kind of project that I'm proposing. So I don't know that there's an element of choice other than that somebody translating something into logic has to make a choice about how to translate it. Does that make sense? Or
So I think maybe I didn't understand this correctly. So it means simply that default logic takes into account exceptions, but does not tell us how to prioritize them, doesn't sequence them.
No, it does. So the type of default logic that I work with is more specifically prioritized default logic. So when you write down the rules, you also write down the relative priorities of the rules. So it's right in what you've written down. So it is prioritized default logic. Yes. And just come back to something you said. I don't make the claim that this is in general or necessarily a superior way to write down the law. This is a very pragmatic claim based entirely on how the law happens to be written in statutes. It could be written in a different way, and then a different logic would be better. So there's a formal result that, in a static sense, anything that could be written down in default logic could be written down in standard logic. These are equivalent in some sense. Now, they're not equivalent in their implementation. They're not equivalent sort of dynamically, but sort of bottom line, they're equivalent. So the claim I'm making is and has to be a pragmatic claim that, given the way the law is written, it is easier and more effective, for reasons that go into the paper, to write it down in this particular way. But I'm not making a general claim about writing down the law or anything like that. It's a very, in some sense, narrow claim based on the specific thing that I'm trying to translate into logic.
You did mention at the beginning that financial law and tax law, tax law, not financial, but tax law in particular, is more appropriate field than other fields of law for the application of default logic. Is it because tax law is so specific and operates clear rules as opposed to interpretive standards like reasonable person standard, for example? Precisely.
So the question, again, it's a pragmatic question of how much can we get from doing this work of translating into logic. I think we can get a lot from translating, say, tax law in the United States, because it's highly rule-based, complex rules, a lot of rules that interact in complicated ways, but are fairly clear-cut. Now, this isn't to say that everything's clear-cut or that there are no ambiguities. There absolutely are. I don't want to minimize that. It's just that in addition to those ambiguities, there's a large chunk of stuff that is pretty straightforward and very complex. There aren't, in the United States, a lot of areas of law that are this complex and this rule-based, both, as opposed to, standards. Or, I mean, could you write down in logic some rule about reasonable person? You could, but what would that have gotten you? The whole thing is, what is a reasonable person? And the way that we reason about that in the United States is through, analogy, really, common law reasoning. I mean, you wouldn't get very far. You haven't done very much. With tax, you have done something because of how complex the rules happen to be. Again, it's a purely pragmatic claim.
It's another example that comes to mind is sentencing and sentencing code, which is also technically, wasn't there some, I'm sure there was something on the continent about codifying it to the huge detriment of the people who are actually subject to it, because there was no discretion.
So this is a really, so in the United, and again, this is way outside my area and I am going to do my best, but I don't know. So we have sentencing guidelines in the United States. And the sentencing guidelines are the kind of thing that you can write down. I mean, they're not, you know, compared to tax law, they're not that complex. Compared to other things, they are fairly complex. So discretion was largely removed there from judges, and as the result, as you say, is sentences that are sometimes quite harsh. The tax law stuff goes beyond the rules versus standards, because it's not just that it's rules, it's the rules that have enormous complexity. And so because of the sort of nature of tax law, because at the end of the year, there has to be a number, an amount that the person pays, there has to be some pretty specific rules about things, because the person needs a number at the end. And unlike many areas of law, many people will never have a personal interaction with the criminal legal system as a defendant. Many will, but many won't. Pretty much everybody is going to have an interaction with the tax system, and it's going to be like more frequently than every year. It's happening all the time. So given that everybody is constantly having to comply with this in a really explicit way, you've got to have something that you don't need a judge checking in every time. You got to have something that's kind of workable, which is how you end up with rules. And then it turns out it's also a really great way to transfer money to people, and which is how you end up with complex rules. It's not entirely fair of me to say. You know, people say, well, why isn't the tax system simpler? Well, the simplest possible tax system would be every single human being in the country pays, I don't know what the number would be, say $500 of tax. But that's plainly a terrible rule, right? Because what about like babies? You know, babies don't have $500, or, you know, then you start talking about, well, some people are rich and some people, so you want us, you mean that's equal, but it's clearly not fair or efficient for that matter. So then you start making changes. And as soon as you start making changes and trying to make things more equitable, well, you can make things more equitable. You can also give out goodies this way through the tax code. You can also try to implement policies this way through the tax code to try to push people in one direction or another by creating incentives. There's just too much you can do through the tax code to keep it simple, essentially.
So much to unpack. When I was reading your article, I kept the objectives very much close to the top of my mind. And thinking about accessibility and transparency and, you know, keeping the government accountable. And one thing that I've observed is this tension between writing or codifying that will be efficient and will achieve of those objectives, but also codifying or coding rather, something that will reflect the law. And you described this tension in your paper, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
So the work in this area that really looks at this tension between being accurate and being accessible is work by Josh Blank and Lawsky, this simplexity paper that I mentioned in the article. So they really dig into that more. And that's the problem that we see running up in these online programs that are supposed to give people guidance, and there's a limit to how accurate they can be if they're going to give clear guidance and all of this. So that's a real tension. I think if you're going to do what I propose in the paper, which is to actually just codify right in code, the code, not taking shortcuts, not trying to make things as dense as possible, just trying to write out what the law is. I think once you have that as your base, you can then implement all kinds of things building off of that. Instead, what we have is a proliferation of different tools, all of which shortcut in particular ways to do the specific thing that they're trying to do. This is not the most efficient way to approach this.
That would be a very interesting proposition in itself, to imagine legislators working through a series of binary questions, because in effect, quite a lot of tax code is binary choices. You either are A or you're not A, or you are B or you're not B. So there are different almost algorithmic paths that I could see that could potentially work.
Yes, so actually some choices are binary, but some choices are not binary, and because we have phase outs and phase ins and brackets. What we do have is discrete choices, and the discrete choices are what allow this stuff to be coded. So I don't need it to be binary, because computers like, I don't know, 2, 10, 20, it doesn't matter to me. And 20 is not an exaggeration, because you can have phase outs that change the rate every $50 of income. I mean, and this really exists in the, because you don't want a cliff effect where when you cross the line, all of a sudden you don't get the benefit. You want to phase that out so that you don't get super distorted behavior. So we have these phase outs, but they happen. And I actually have, they happen by every $50. I'm like, if you really had computers involved, why don't they just, give it a function and let it happen, continue, instead of this stair step. But that's kind of beside the point. The point, though, is that it is a set of discrete choices. And it's, I put together a website for my students that generates problems for them based on the code. So it just practice problems for them to practice applying the law. It was time consuming to write it, but it really wasn't that hard. I mean, okay, it took me a long time. I don't want to diminish that it took me a long time, but it wasn't usually super hard to figure out how to write the law into the computer code so that it would generate problems for them. Yeah.
I would add to that I'm a huge fan of no-code trend. So when you have no-code platforms now for lawyers, so they can design their own apps to use in-house. So that's my experience working in-house for a while, with trying to digitize things and how technically easy it can get.
Yeah, it can be pretty straightforward. Absolutely.
It's a little bit like what WordPress is to website building.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
No-code platforms are to digitizing your documents.
Yeah, it can really be pretty straightforward. And I think we're in a funny situation where everyone is a heavy tech user, but tech is so smooth that actually people don't know anything about tech. I'm constantly surprised by, I think people know less now than, the idea that that my phone is built so that I can't open it up, I just think is so outrageous. But, in so many different ways, right? It's so limited what kind of interventions that we can make in the tech, both the hardware and the software for much at this point. But that said, when people are willing to start engaging with it, and it's really not that hard. I mean, I think for coding the actual law, it will be hard because you have to get, that gets a little specific. And it's why I think having a programming language that's designed to do it is the way forward. And then you do it, but then you can use that as the base for creating other types of maybe no code approaches once you have this actually coded as the base that you can work off of.
I wonder if that proposition would be attractive to legislators for different reasons than efficiency, because when you think about politics, and of course tax law is highly politicized, I wonder if that kind of clarity and efficiency wouldn't be like in this old joke about a lawyer who's on his deathbed and his daughter comes in and takes over his office and comes back and says, "Oh, Dad, I just closed down that case that you've been working on for the last 25 years." And he's like, "You stupid idiot, this paid for your flat and there's paid for your degree." And I wonder if the same would be true with politicians. There are certain issues that even just for electoral purposes are an easy carrot or an easy stick to dangle over people. Whereas if you put it in code, there is nowhere to escape. You have to make those decisions and you have to make them clearly.
No, I think actually in tax law, at least you can have, I definitely hear you about wanting to be able to keep ambiguity. And there's no reason you can't do that when you're coding the law. So I think an important thing to keep in mind when you think about writing the law into code is that you can keep a tremendous amount of ambiguity. The biggest way you keep ambiguity is you just say that you take a term like principal residence or something, and don't define it in the code. And then there's your ambiguity. I mean, the person has to decide what the input is, and you can leave it as ambiguous as you want. Another reason that it's kind of good for Congress to leave ambiguity is because sometimes Congress isn't the best ones to figure out the specific rules. That's Treasury, and the Treasury needs to do that. Or the issue is that it's not that you're going to eliminate ambiguity this way. It's that you're going to hone in on the things that are ambiguous and code the things that aren't ambiguous. And there's so much that isn't ambiguous that this way you highlight the actual ambiguities and don't have to worry about the stuff that is complex but clear. So this doesn't actually involve getting rid of ambiguities. It doesn't limit the ability of legislators to, leave potential for whatever kind of fundraising they might do off of the law. That's all completely remains. You can kind of think of it as like there's this complex, clear core, and then a cloud around it of lots of ambiguity, lots of things that aren't resolved. We can just get the core coded. We're not going to get rid of the stuff around it. And that's never, that's never going to happen, nor should it. I mean, it's part of the political process. It's the nature of language. Like none of that's going to be ever completely resolved. But the core part that's like clear and complex, that is what we can code.
So in other words, we can perhaps use the language of HLA Hart between core and penumbra of law, that certain areas of the law are clear and unambiguous.
Right.
And there are penumbral cases that require this human intervention, and to those you need humans.
Right.
Except my difficulty with this is that the distinction between core and penumbral cases cannot be always clearly made, because sometimes the external circumstances themselves change. And
That's
something
true.
that has been the same rule for many years, suddenly against a novel background becomes a different rule. I'm not sure if I can think of something like that in tax law.
So probably not, because well, yes, you can think of it. I mean, because the good example of this is what happened with cryptocurrency, and then that was, they came up with rules, but that didn't change what the underlying law was. That changed what might be the input there. You could have an argument, is this the kind of thing you should include in this category or not? And that's fine. And then, of course, what happened with this is what happens with tax law a lot, which is the IRS was like, now we're going to come out with a clear ruling that resolves this, because when there's money at stake and people are doing this every year, you don't sit around waiting for a judge to resolve it. You just make a rule and then people need to follow it. So, and then sort of enforcement came from that. But that doesn't change the fact that there are a core set of rules that are very complex that we can write down, and that later, and we leave things as like, put in something here. What goes in there? I don't know. That can change. That can, be hard to capture. Background facts can change. So the question with gains from cryptocurrency was, is it more like a foreign currency, or is it more like an investment item? Who knows? I mean, it ended up getting resolved in a way that made a lot of sense. But, regardless, you pick one, and then that's what gets input into the relevant rule. And so the underlying, I do think there's the law is complex and difficult, in a way that's difficult for us and easy for computers. And we can take that part and like write it down and leave the hard stuff. It stays hard, and when facts change, what might go in as a particular input might change. But that doesn't mean that the sort of these, and we know, by the way, that this can be done because this is what tax forms do. So we have these algorithms. I don't want this to sound like I'm proposing this radical new thing where we formalize the law. It's formalized. That's what tax forms are. Literally, it's like right in the name, people. They're forms, and we have these programs that they don't have the law under there. They've got the forms under there. So the IRS already knows that some of this stuff can be broken down to algorithms, and they've done it for us. They have worksheets, they have forms. So I'm not proposing this brand new idea of formalizing things. Things are already formalized. I'm saying, let's do it in a way that's better and more transparent.
It's incredible. It's very refreshing indeed that you're very much aware of the limits as to what can and cannot be done with logic. There are some commentators who have hold greater promise in terms of computing legal field altogether. This is true, for example, of the hopes that are now held of mediation systems that work for eBay and the likes, platforms that the idea is to implement eBay mediation as a model for dispute resolution in simple cases in courts in the UK. However, my reservation here is that can we resolve all kinds of disputes with reference to coding and with reference to So
I'm deeply skeptical about this. I mean, I want to be in a way that I don't want to denigrate this project, because I love this project, and I have and the people I'm working on it with are like great, and I think they would actually agree with what I'm about to say is we're really trying to answer a very boring question here. And this is not, we're going to fix it all. There's no more judges or the whole law is in there. We're just trying to say, we're already doing this. Can we write it down a little bit better? And the hard stuff, oh yeah, that's still going to be hard. I mean, like, we can't predict any outcomes based on this. We can't, this doesn't replace a judge. It doesn't replace a mediator. We're trying to do this kind of core thing that's already happening in a lot of ways and is not happening in a particularly efficient way, and come up with a language that is really good for this job. And let's get the kind of boring core done as cleanly and efficiently as possible. One of the folks on this team with me is working with a state that has a particular set of rules, and I'll leave it ambiguous because and they were running it off of like tables that they had drawn, like and spreadsheets. And so it's not a matter of we're going to be like artificial intelligence or something. It's like, hey, you know what? Instead of having like these hand-drawn tables and spreadsheets, we're going to write some computer code for you that does what you were doing anyway, but does it in the way that's really clean, that's really readable, that has a lot of accountability because it has these comments done in a particular way. We're going to do it with a teamwork between a computer scientist and a lawyer to make sure that this really matches up on both sides. And it's going to be really easy to fix, to amend in the future because it matches up so closely with the structure of your actual rules. In some ways it's banal. I just think it's a banality that has a lot of potential for helping things and for changing things.
So to me, that's refreshing for different reasons, Emilia, but it's music to my ears because working, attending loads of, especially what they call legal innovation these days, which is effectively legal problem solving, posing as innovation. There is this trend now to make simple solutions seem more exciting than they actually are, or to inflate how innovative they are, or to inflate how much change you are making. And it's almost tiring because to a person who is really process driven or really just rational, it just seems like there are just certain things that need improvement, and here is the way to do them.
Yes.
And a very simple example of this is how legal teams work and how they record their work. It's not uncommon, especially in the public sector, for legal teams to work from personal PCs, from their own email accounts. Nothing is traceable, nothing is transparent, and everything is a mess, right? And then every now and then you have somebody who comes over and says, maybe we can start with a spreadsheet. Let's just start noting it down. And then they buy MS Office and they start using MS Lists, right?
Right.
And it seems like those projects, to me, are always the ones that change the reality the most.
Yes, I completely, totally agree with this. And one of the ways that I added value when I was an associate at a law firm, even as a very junior associate, is I was good at using Excel. And I was able to model pricing of certain deals. The client had a particular thing, a tax result that they wanted. And I was the only person who could run it on an Excel spreadsheet. They had to take me everywhere. I was a junior tax associate. They had to take me to the closing. I mean, there are so many tools that we have available to us now. And the tools, as you say, I completely agree with what you're saying, because the tools are getting, fancier and more complex and more marketed. And in fact, if someone could just come in and say, this is something I would love to see. And I think everyone would love to see this. And I think it doesn't exist because of the desire to make things so fancy. Wouldn't you like a program that lets you load in the boilerplate for all the different kinds of deals that your firm did, and then told you to enter the parties, enter the prices, enter the assets, and make certain elections about what you wanted to look like, and then produce the first draft of the document for you with everything filled in, done as you wanted because it had all this boilerplate language to draw from, and then you took that draft and started working on it.
So I've been speaking to a group of people about some collaborative effort in the city on something similar. So it would also
that's really simple, right? How is it though that it's 2021 and you're speaking to a group of people about this? This could have been done with the technology 20 years ago, and instead this is not hard to implement, at all. I mean, it's unbelievably easy. Does it involve machine learning? It does not. Does it involve artificial intelligence? It does not. How would you sell this? It sounds boring and trivial and yet it would streamline things so much. It would make such a positive difference in the day-to-day. It would save clients so much money. Like, but again, but how do you sell it? So this is part of what I really love about this project is Denis Marigot, who is leading the project, who's a graduate student at INRIA. He'll graduate this, assuming everything goes as planned, which I'm sure it will. He and the other members of the team take the approach that this language has to be open source. And for the law, it's critical that this code be open to everyone. Everyone can see it. Everyone can work with it. There's no, so far as I know, there's no goal. There's no profit goal here. The idea is, because you just want something that works. You don't want something that works. You don't want to have to try to sell it to people. You just want something that works.
Don't try to sell this idea. Like I can almost imagine somebody listening into this conversation and then figuring out in Silicon Valley just like how to sell it to the US government,
Well, that's why the conversation has to be with the governments from the beginning. Because here's the other thing that I do think that somebody, and I've been saying this for a number of years now, and somebody is going to do this. I don't know if they're going to do it with this programming language. Frankly, I don't know if they've already done it. But if I were trying to make my clients a lot of money, I would have already, because it's not going to take that long. It's going to take a certain number of years. It's a very discrete task. I would have done it, and I would be sitting there in my office in New York, generating tax shelters for my clients. And I would roll them out, and when they would get shut down, and then my marginal cost of rolling out another one would be zero. And so I do think that government needs to get on this and do this, because I think it's going to happen in private industry if it doesn't. And I don't think that someone from Silicon Valley would try to sell it to the government. I think they would try to sell it from some way that could be monetized. It's not going to be monetized through the government. So this is my concern. It's a big concern. And it's why I'm trying to, we're trying to have these conversations and get these conversations started, because, you want things to be open source and openly available from the very beginning. And that's the path to set things on.
I just wondered if I could touch upon the matter which you mentioned before. You said that this system is incredibly simple. And that's clear advantage of systems based on default logic or even formal logics. So systematizing or formalizing law is not as difficult as we think. But is there any potential for those formal systems to produce injustice and result in injustice? Is it only a matter of input, that we fail to input enough data into that system? Again, I'm thinking of eBay, for example. So eBay seems to be incorporating their own contract that you have with the seller, and
right.
It seems to ignore external factors. So, for example, it fails to acknowledge the distinction between private sellers and business sellers, and the fact that the burden of proof works differently with private sellers as opposed to business sellers. So a private seller doesn't need to accept automatically a return just because the customer said that the item is not as described, because the burden of proof is on the buyer to show that the item was not as described, something that business seller will have to automatically accept. Right. So there are certain data that are not taken into account, and that could result in justice being denied.
Absolutely, no question. And that's why, again, what we're talking about is just trying to do as faithful as possible a translation of the actual law, just the parts that can actually be done, and then making that available. Can you code in unfairness? Absolutely, 100% yes. You do not even need to get into data before, set aside the problems with sort of algorithmic bias based on big data. Absolutely, you could put something, all code is just going to do what the coder tells it to do. Can you code something that's unfair? 100% yes. Is in some, if you believe that the tax law as it stands is unjust, then when you're writing the tax law into code, you're writing injustice into code. There's no question about it. No question about it. I'm not making any kind of argument that when you do this, you somehow are guaranteeing fairness or guaranteeing justice. It's completely up to what goes into the code itself.
Before we start wrapping it up, because I'm very conscious of the time, there's one more question that I would like to touch upon. And you write about pair programming. And I think pair programming in many ways may be the future of the private sector, in terms of the legal sector, at least.
Yeah.
There is much to be said about the push for lawyers to be coders and how that works out in practice, or rather how it doesn't work out in practice, right? And there's a huge push for hiring computer science graduates now and pushing them on, technology. In the UK, we have training contracts, so it's like pushing them through this technology/law route into the profession. And I wonder if that can, in practical terms, be pair programming. I mean, if that can, in practical terms, be pushed onto the legal sector.
I hope so. So let me just define what pair programming is, right? So pair programming in computer science is the idea that you have two programmers sitting down together and they look at each other's code as they code and they really work collaboratively. Pair programming, as I'm using it here and as the Catala team uses it, is that you have a computer programmer and a lawyer, and then we sit down together and together we work on creating the code and have a conversation as we go back and forth. So I know like a little bit about coding, so I can kind of see what he's doing, and he knows a little bit about the statute, usually because I've written something up for him in advance, or the lawyer's written something up for him in advance that he's read. He can ask those questions, we can have a back and forth. And as you say, this has a big advantage because it means that you don't have to take someone who's trained as a lawyer and also train them to be a coder. And the analogy that always comes to mind is interdisciplinary work, essentially. Right. So when you have, and this is particularly true in used to be more true in US law schools. And we see in US law schools increasingly that people who are becoming US legal academics also have PhDs. I think this is really valuable because if you're going to be doing, for certain areas of study, if you're going to be doing interdisciplinary work, there's really no shortcut other than being fully trained in the other discipline. How many lawyers are you going to be able to fully train to be really top-notch coders? That's going to limit your ability to get this stuff coded. So I think pair programming is a great approach that you have the lawyer learn just a little tiny bit about coding so that they just kind of know what they're looking at. I mean, just the very basics. And then, pair people up, have them work it together. I mean, I do think that's the way forward. It's the way to get really high quality code.
You touched on my pet peeve there. So one of my biggest pet peeves is in legal academia is when we're trying to be, and back to empirical studies and empirical research, how we're trying to tell all those really experienced empirical researchers that we know the truth to how empirical studies work. And then we get things wrong literally all the time.
Yeah, I mean, that would be we need another hour interview to talk about this issue because it's a really serious issue. But I do think we're starting to see some change there within the US Legal Academy, as we do see increasingly, even over the last 5 years, more and more entry-level candidates who are hired, who have PhDs in some area, not just a random area, but the area in which they do their work. More and more co-authoring, I think, which is also good. So maybe I'm fooling myself, but I'm telling myself that we're starting to maybe see some more respect for other areas of study, which will just result in higher quality work.
Yeah, we can just call it an overarching collaborative theme.
Yeah, I mean, and that always has to be the answer. The idea that any one person or any one area is going to have the full answer is just, it's implausible on its face.
Amazing. Emilia, do you have anything else to add, or should we ask our 5 questions?
I think we can go ahead and ask the 5 questions. We mindful of time as well, because we've been talking here for almost an hour now. So yeah, I think Aleksandra, go ahead.
I think we need to add to the notes for the second season, just to pinpoint this conversation on empirical legal studies, because now I really want to pick your brains about it. But so question number 1, who or what was your biggest inspiration in your career?
I worked with a lot of wonderful professors, and I've mentioned some of them. David Malaman was wonderful, Sean Walsh, my advisor, Kai Wehmeyer. These people were hugely influential, but I have to say my biggest inspiration was really my mother, who was, when I was growing up, was studying for a PhD in statistics. This was a long time ago. This was not a super common thing. She had boxes in the house of the cards that were used to program computers at the time. So with sort of these card boxes would be sitting on our shelves. She had books about symbolic logic sitting around the house. she would take me to her work and show me the mainframe. I sat in the back of the class while she taught as a graduate student. And this, I think, was the first symbolic logic book I saw was Irving Copey's Symbolic Logic. And that was her book that was on a bookshelf in our house. So I think she really is my biggest influence.
That's so fantastic, isn't it, Emilia? We need more. I feel like we need more role models like this in general. My first experience of logic was with a very old male law professor who was repeating his book for, he's been repeating his book for the last 30 years. Not the best of starts, but then life has changed and I grew to love it. But so, question number 2, what do you wish you could tell your graduate student self?
I think I just wish I could tell her, you will finish the degree. You'll finish it. That's all.
I suppose that's a common problem amongst researchers who go on to complete their PhDs and research projects way beyond what they initially envisaged. I can definitely relate to that.
I can tattoo it tentatively on my forearm, just in case for the future. If you could only read one book for the rest of your life, what would it be?
This was a hard question. And ultimately, I think it would be the Bible, just because it's just hard to think of a match when it comes to long, influential collections of law and stories and history and prose and poetry. There's just so much in it. I think I could probably spend a long time with that book.
It's interesting because you're not the only one who gave that answer.
I was about to say that this is not the first time this answer crops up, and I wonder if this is one of those sources that contain so profound wisdom that anyone can find something.
Profound wisdom, but also so many different kinds of things. It's such a diverse set of things. It almost feels cheating to say that it's one book, because I started to think. I was like, well, it would be an anthology of some kind, right? A collection of different kinds of writing by different authors. I was like, wait a minute. Collection of different kinds of writings by different authors that covers different genres. I was like, yeah, there's kind of an obvious one here.
Amazing. If you had not been an academic, what alternative career would you have chosen?
I'm not sure. I think this counts as an alternative career. I would have been a teacher. And not an academic, but a teacher. My mom was a teacher. My grandmother was a teacher. My aunt was a teacher. I really love teaching. And I think I would be a teacher even if I were not an academic.
Wow, this was a very definitive answer. I think many of my students would envy you for that, because when I ask them whom they want to be even at this stage, in their advanced studies, they still don't know if they want to become lawyers at all.
I'll tell you that I actually suspect that this is genetic. I'm not kidding, because when my daughter was very little, like a toddler, and the other kids were playing mommy, she was playing teacher, and she was too little to really understand that that's what I was doing. And she would put all of her little dolls out, and they were in class and they were taking naps. I mean, so I kind of just wonder, it kind of just feels sort of built in.
Suddenly the response that I gave to my parents when I was like 3 or 4, when they asked me who I wanted to be when I grew up, a hit woman. Sounds like a...
Well, I should say that since then, she's sort of had a diversity of goals, and I don't know if she will be a teacher, but there was something driving her in that direction. I think it's possible, exactly.
Excellent. Finish this sentence. That's a final one. One thing no one talks about in academia is...
This was hard because there's so much social media, there's so much publishing opportunities. I don't think I'm clever enough to think of something that no one talks about. So I think I'm just going to say, I wish that people in academia talked more about and believed that one's worth as a person in no way depends on one's career or one's success or how much publishing or anything, that every single person, regardless of whether they have a job, much less what job is, much less how they perform at the job, merits equal respect and is of equal value. And I think many people in academia are willing to say that and maybe believe it about other people, but I wish more people could accept it about themselves.
This is an incredible observation and wish, I would say, especially in academia, because academia seems to be pervaded by certain fantasies of superiority that certain academics indulge in, and in the legal field even more so, where you can find people finding themselves superior simply because of what they do. So this was something I did not expect to hear, but it's incredible and very thoughtful, I think.
It's deeply profound and really suited to a philosophy podcast, I think. But just to add, what you said is particularly important to early career researchers, because it's very easy in the age of social media and in the age of everybody having blogs and everybody having, getting out there. It's very easy to forget that you should just do what you love and just be happy with what you do, and success eventually will come in one shape or form. But there is this, and I think it's destroying a lot of people along the way, this pressure to fit in and the pressure to participate in the race.
Yep. Yeah.
Wow.
And on that positive note.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Well, it was a real pleasure speaking with you. Really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you.
This has been such a pleasure, and I think we're definitely going to need to schedule another one in the future.
Let me know when.
Thank you so much.
All right, great. Thank you. Take good care.
Hi, it's Aleksandra here. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you like our project, have any questions, or would like to recommend a guest or a topic, drop us a line on just.theory.project@gmail.com. This season was made possible with the generous funding of Newcastle University. If you like, you can buy us a coffee. Your support will enable us to continue our work. Just Theory, changing the face of legal theory.